look at whenever someone is throwing this term wage slavery in our face is step one, distinguish the difference between slavery as traditionally defined and wage slavery. And the primary difference that I can see as I look at this is under slavery, it's one person owning another person. But in wage slavery, we're simply saying that if you have to work in order to provide for yourself, that there's something inherently wrong with that, as if you are entitled to food, shelter, clothing, etc. And the biggest question that we have to ask here, right, at a fundamental level, because for most conservatives, we look at this, it just seems absurd. But if someone's really serious about this, the first question that we have to ask is, okay, what's the alternative? Right? You're now suggesting to me that if I have to work for a living, that somehow that's akin to slavery. Well, what's the alternative? Is the alternative not working for a living? And in that case, the real question is, well, okay, well then how am I supposed to provide for myself? Because if you're suggesting that people should have access to food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education, whatever it is, if they should just have access to it without having to contribute anything in order to receive those benefits, well, can you show me somewhere else in nature where this is the reality? And you see this a lot sometimes where the same people that are talking about wage slavery will then say, well, with so much wealth in the world, why do some people live in poverty? And the question I like to pose back is, well, wait a second, poverty is the natural state of mankind, right? Where poverty is what's natural. The production of wealth, and certainly the abundance of wealth that we see in a lot of places, especially here in the United States, that's the anomaly. So the question should not be about, well, why is this person so wealthy and how can we take it from them in order to give it to somebody that is somebody else? The question we should be asking ourselves is, how do people acquire wealth? And then how do we replicate that sort of behavior so that everybody can have access to food, shelter, clothing, medicine, education, etc. All right, but if you're going to say that the natural state, right, which is poverty, it's the idea that when you are born, you are not necessarily entitled to something else. If you're going to say that that is somehow inherently wrong, evil, or immoral, and therefore requires some sort of action on behalf of other people, well, I'm going to have to ask you to explain that further, right? And that's the first question you should ask is like, what is wrong with the notion of providing value to someone else in order to get value in return? What is problematic about that? Because I certainly understand the problem with someone saying that it was inappropriate during feudalism for someone to be a serf and to essentially be owned by their feudal lord and have to till the land and provide crops and pay taxes and all these other things without having any real freedom or control over their own destiny. Like I understand the problem with that. That was a legal structure that was akin to slavery. But you're now saying that just the mere fact that I would have to provide value to someone else in order to get value in return, if that's also slavery, well, that doesn't seem to match the same definition. And so I'm going to start to believe that you're using the term slavery not because it's an honest representation of what's taking place within that free market exchange, but because you're trying to essentially manipulate me into thinking I'm a victim, when in reality, I'm simply a voluntary partner to an exchange. Now, they will sometimes fire back and say, well, no, if you have to work to provide all these things for yourself, then this idea that you can simply walk away from your job is ridiculous, because if you walk away from your job, you lose the paycheck and therefore you lose the ability to provide yourself. And so therefore you're enslaved to the job. To which our response should be, well, wait, no, you're not enslaved to a particular job. You can potentially move jobs. You can move somewhere else. You can find an opportunity somewhere else. Provided that person is not using force or some sort of legal structure to require you to work there, you still have freedom. Now, does that mean that you have the same freedom as someone that was born into a wealthy family? No, they're probably going to have more options. But in and of itself, that is not necessarily the result of some sort of cosmic injustice. Right? Again, it goes back to the idea of the natural state of mankind is poverty. And so the idea to use our talents and our abilities and our strength and the resources available to us in order to create wealth or prosperity is just, again, a part of reality. So to suggest that having to provide value in order to get value is somehow akin to slavery is a little bit ridiculous on a fundamental level, right? It's almost as if you're dreaming of a world that does not exist. So that's the first point that we bring up. But let's go to the second point. Let's say you bring all that up and you try to explain to someone how, slavery is traditionally understood versus wage slavery doesn't make any sense. It's not a fair comparison. And in fact, it's a way to manipulate language in order to try to convince people that they're a victim when they're probably not. Not to say that they aren't, but maybe they probably aren't if you're just saying that working for a living is essentially the same as being a slave. All right, so if they're still committed to that idea, let's say that you've provided a very logical defense for why that's not a fair comparison, and they are sticking with it. Here's the next question that you have to ask them. What's your solution? Right? If you really believe that the idea that anyone in the marketplace has to provide value in order to receive value, right? If you think that's inherently wrong, and that people should just naturally be able to expect food, clothing, housing, medicine, education, whatever else it is, without having to contribute anything, how would you achieve that? Right? How would you possibly achieve that? And here's what's interesting. Because when typically every person that I've talked with or every person that I've read that has talked about wage slavery has essentially come back and their solution to the problem is government confiscation and redistribution, or an advanced version of that is government control over the economy. And here's the question I've got to ask. If your solution to the fact that some people have things and other people don't have things is to not analyze the different decisions that individuals made, right? You're not going to give any sort of attention to why one person has less and one person has more. You're simply going to say that if this person has more and this person has less, then we have some sort of, societal duty or governmental duty to take from the one that has more and give to the person that has less. And the way you're going to accomplish that is by using government force and coercion. Well, what sort of system have you put in place? You now have a system where one person is forced to work and produce, and then you're going to confiscate the fruits of their labor to give to somebody else that is not required to work or produce? What does that sound like? Well, to me, it sounds a lot like the traditional definition of slavery.